It's not even necessarily like talent only. It's also like, what's the energy you're bringing and like how well do you collaborate with everyone? That honestly is where most of the value comes from when you're working with people. And it's like not necessarily the fact that someone can physically stay in the seat till exactly 7 p.m. or till 2 a.m. or whatever.
Hey Hatchlings, welcome to the Motion Hatch podcast. I'm your host, Hayley Akins. Hey, thanks for tuning in to the Motion Hatch podcast. If you haven't heard the show before, we talk about the business side of motion design and animation. So we mainly talk about things like freelancing and what to charge your clients and what you should be putting in your contracts and all that other good stuff. So on this week's episode, we have Michelle Higa Fox. She's the founder of Slanted Studios. We covered things like what the realities of getting representation is like, what success means to her and how that's changed over time. And we talked a bit about her being a new parent and how she's balanced that with her work and how it's changed her mindset. So this was just a great episode. I really appreciate her coming on. She's just really fantastic and we had such a great conversation. So I hope you all enjoy this one. I'll see you on the other side. Hey, Michelle, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on the show. I love it.
Cool. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I thought it was really funny when I was doing some research, was that I found a picture of you on your website when you're a baby in front of all these 1980s computers. And it said that your mum was a computer programmer and your dad was a field engineer. I just wanted to know if you felt like that helped you get into motion design.
Yeah, I love that picture. And I think it's only now that I'm older and I recently had a son that I realize how strange it is that my parents have this photograph of me in front of 3 like 10-inch floppy disk, over 100-pound computers in like 1982. But to answer your question, I don't think motion graphics specifically, but I think that having computers around the house definitely created an atmosphere where they weren't something strange or something exotic. They were just a very big part of my life from very early on. And I actually remember being pretty young, like 6 or 7 years old, and my mother had this computer programming job an hour drive away from our house. And I remember one day my father taking us to one of the computer terminals in the house and like telling me to type on it. And then it typed back. And it was my mom remote accessing the machine from an hour drive away. But this was, in the late 80s. So it was like quite early on, which is in retrospect, pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's so cool. I was like, wow, that's such a cool photo. I wish I had something like that to share. It's wicked. So you've done so much stuff. It's really impressive. Obviously now you run Slanted Studios, but you used to be part of Mixtape Club. Do you want to tell us a bit about your journey before Slanted Studios?
Totally. I actually studied interactive artwork when I was in college. And my first jobs out of school were working in kind of arts nonprofits. And I worked as a professional artist assistant. And then I did quite a bit of freelancing in the New York circuit, freelancing at shops like Stardust Studios and Brand New School and PSYOP. And then I also was part of a directors collective called Mixtape Club, which is actually still around, which I started with Chris Smith and Jesse Casey out of college. We did that for about 8 years. We were lucky enough to get picked up by Hornet Inc. and Passion Pictures. So we were able to learn the craft of becoming commercial directors. And that was all kind of leading towards eventually I left Mixtape Club to start Slanted Studios as my own company so that I could go full circle and focus on interactive work in addition to motion graphics.
Yeah, that's really cool. I just wanted to ask you about how it was kind of making that collective straight after, school, like university, as we call it over here. But, how did that idea come about?
So it's interesting. We all met, and it was Chris, Jesse, and I, but it was also a group of other collaborators, Leah Bieferman, Tavit Gilson, Noah Norman, Bennett Barbaco. We all met because we were in these very strange courses at the time. You have to keep in mind, this is like over a dozen years ago. Like animation, motion graphics, like had just started being taught. Like we were the last class that got to touch film because mini DV cameras had just started to get introduced. So we were in these weird classes that were like learning DVD studio production, or like there was a class called hypertext fiction that was like a fiction writing workshop, but you were using HTML or HyperCard. And so we all met because we were creating these weird pieces of artwork that no one got to see outside of the classroom. So we decided to form a DVD magazine as a school publication. And that was a very fun bonding experience. And because we did that in our last year of school, when we all graduated, we thought we should just start a company together because we want to keep making things together. And I understand now, looking back, how many unique forces had to have come into play for that to happen. But at the time, it just felt very natural. And I also, now looking back, am amazed that my parents didn't think it was super strange. When I was like, I'm just starting a company with my schoolmates. But they just kind of like were like, we don't understand what you're doing. But sure, why not? As long as you can pay a rent.
Do you think that you'd recommend that to someone now? Or do you think you'd say like, you know, go to a full-time job or whatever first to kind of get some experience?
You know what? I don't think they're mutually exclusive, as strange as that sounds. Because Chris, Jesse, and I were totally working full-time while we also were forming our identity under Mixtape Club. So it's kind of this idea of like, if you always are continuing to build a portfolio together under a name, or I guess you could say under a brand, that's a body of work that you're building. And that's not mutually exclusive to having a job. You know, although I understand like time is always a resource. I guess the bigger question is like, would you recommend trying to jump straight into freelance versus like taking on a full-time job right out of school?
Yeah.
And I think I really enjoyed freelancing, but I think the freelance situation I was in was almost like taking a staff position because I was essentially permalance at one studio for the first year and a half. And, you know, in retrospect, I probably should have tried to get some of the benefits of being on staff, like health insurance and the other securities you get. But I was just so happy to be getting paid to be animating. It never really crossed my mind that I actually essentially was an employee and should have been getting some of the benefits of being an employee. I think as a side note, like I definitely think straight out of school, there are huge benefits to working at a place where there is some sort of structure and you can kind of see what the process is of what happens in a professional animation context. Because like now looking back, I'm like, wow, when I started, I didn't even know what a pitch was, let alone like how to prepare a pitch deck. I mean, we were pretty organized, but being in a professional environment forced us to become so much more organized in terms of how you prep your files, like learning how to check in with your producer, like just kind of learning the ropes of how things get made.
Yeah, I think that's quite important. And I think it's good that, you know, you were doing freelance and you were trying to do the Mixtape Club stuff. Because from the outside, sometimes, you know, people look at stuff and they're like, wow, like everyone just did that and they went straight into Mixtape Club and then they were an amazing company and they got work all the time and they didn't have to do the other stuff. And, you know, I just think it's like really cool to kind of shed some light on that. I was a big fan, and I remember because I was like working full time at the time that you kind of do Mixtape Club, and I remember you did that Yay Say a video, and I was like, that's awesome. You know, I didn't really know who you were or anything like that, but I was like, that's so cool. I wish I was making music videos. But like the reality of making music videos and stuff like that sometimes I know can be tough. Was that your kind of experience as well? Yeah.
Oh, and thank you. I'm so glad you liked the video. It's nice to hear that it made people smile.
Yeah, definitely.
It's funny because I think a lot of times when you look at people's careers, or, it's easy to look back and be like, oh, they did this and they did this and then they did this, and it seems so immediate. But the breaks we took in between each personal project, it was 8 to 14 months in between when we outputted a portfolio piece at the beginning. And that's a really long time. Like that's not like success overnight. That's like, I'm working professionally as a motion graphics artist, like, going to work every day, getting better at my craft, but also saving up money. And then, you wait like a year basically in between for those gigs. And then it's like, and you don't know when you take the time off to do those personal projects or to make them, if it's necessarily going to pay off. Like, I think when we made those music videos, it was more, I think we did have ambitions that, we wanted them to be seen and we wanted them to like people to like them. But it was more about finally getting the opportunity to make the thing that was in our heads, as opposed to like realizing the style frames and storyboards we were getting handed at work every day. But I think because the time was so rare in between when we got the opportunity to work on it, we didn't pin much more hopes on it than that, because you get to swing the bat so few times that I guess just getting to swing the bat has to be its own reward. Because if you're hoping for more than that, it's just like, you can't control it,
Yeah. So were you thinking like Mixtape Club was kind of like your side personal sort of project, and then like your freelancing or your permalancing was like how you were making your money?
Yeah, I think it was exactly that. And I do feel very lucky that I thought both of them were very rewarding. It's just, they were rewarding in different ways, And I think actually the longer I worked, being able to separate the two allowed me to get better at both. Because I think at the beginning, I put so much of my personal self-worth attached to the work I did commercially. And it's not that I don't feel that way now. I think it's just that, like, I'm not trying to shoehorn certain visual or creative ideas into briefs where it's like that idea might not be actually the best fit for the brief. Because I think what happened was initially I was like so fixated on like wanting to do certain visual ideas or tell certain stories that I was like, every brief I was getting, I was like, oh my God, I want to do it this way. I want to do it this way. And I wasn't holistically thinking about what's actually the best way to execute this that meets the client's needs or makes for the best project, like for this particular project's needs, because I was so fixated on like trying to nail a certain visual style. And then I think by separating out my personal projects from the commercial work allowed me to bring a clearer eye to the commercial work, to be like, what does this project really need? Like, what is actually the best style for it? And then with the artwork to just be like, here, I am literally just trying to execute this idea in my head.
Yeah, I think that's quite important, because I see that a lot where people are trying to like, oh, let's just make something pretty, or let's shoehorn this idea in because we really want to, not because it's the best for the client or the best way to solve the problem. So yeah, that's really interesting. So were you working at Mixtape Club kind of full time towards the end before you started Slanted?
Yeah, so from the time we signed with Hornet, which was just after Yesayer, to basically when I started Slanted, I was full time at Mixtape Club. We were very lucky that like we were based in New York and Hornet is based in New York. So we would go into the office every day in Soho. More often than not, there was a job going on or there was a brief that was in. So we'd work on the pitch. And if there's nothing going on, we'd just brainstorm on what's an internal mixtape project we can work on.
So do you think that it's good to get representation if you're a director then?
I think it's interesting because the industry has changed so much. There was a long period of time where I usually recommended to people that representation can be totally great. Just make sure it's non-exclusive representation. Because in my personal experience, like there are amazing reps out there, but it's quite often that like a rep isn't necessarily going to bring you enough work that can be equivalent to a full-time salary for the whole year. And that's a lot of pressure for the rep to be bringing you that much work. And some reps can, but in my experience, usually a rep will bring you a couple jobs a year, which is fabulous. But it's like most of the directors I know have to freelance on the side, or usually if you're at the point where you're getting repped, you have a lot of your own clients anyway. So it's like they have clients that are coming to them independent of the rep and they're running jobs. So it's like the rep is, you know, in the best case scenario, kind of a business mentor agent where it's someone that's helping you grow professionally. They're helping you make connections, but they're also giving you advice on your career and helping you grow it and like helping coach you to figure out how you want to grow and like clarify what your goals are. And like also like through the bidding process, like helping you be smart about how to bid it and professionally, you know, have the relationship with the client and do what's needed through the project. But it's a very rare shot where they're bringing you enough work that it can be exclusive and they really are your only avenue through which sales are coming in.
Yeah, I think that's quite an important point because, you know, you could get into a bit of a pickle, I guess, if you only had to work exclusively for them. So what made you decide to kind of leave Mixtape Club and make Slanted Studios?
So there's a combination of factors. One was I was given an opportunity to work on a large-scale interactive installation, and that had been a dream of mine for a long time. So that was definitely the catalyst that allowed me to finally say, like, you know, I don't think I can do basically what was a full-time art commission and professionally work as a commercial director at the same time. So I had to make a choice. But I think in addition to that, by the time I left Mixtape Club, we had been together for 8 years, and you grow a lot after 8 years. So it's like we were probably all 30 years old by then. So it's like when you're 30, you're really different. You're just in a totally different place with different needs than when you're 22, just out of university. And I think our visions for like what success was were different by then. So I think at the time it was quite traumatic. Like I remember, and I don't think Chris and Jesse will mind me saying this at all, but like I remember having a lunch at this like Mexican restaurant we used to go to quite a bit, and like we're all just crying. And I remember like calling one of my friends after leaving the restaurant because like every day since I graduated college, it's like I woke up and I kind of knew I had a sense of purpose. Like I was like, okay, like what can I do to make Mixtape Club more successful? And like now that that was no longer the answer, I was like, what am I doing? Or what do I do? Like I don't even know what to do anymore. I think all three of us felt that it was like we only kind of had known how to work together in this one way. And it was a really great relationship. And like, I still to this day miss making things with Chris and Jesse. Like, it was really great. But it was like, I don't think we had the tools at the time to know how to evolve the company and how to evolve how we collaborated. And we tried for so long to keep it together. And like, we didn't want to break up, you know, but it was definitely time. I think because of what I said, like we couldn't figure out how to evolve the way we collaborated. So it just made sense. And it's funny because like where I'm at now, I feel almost like if I had the perspective and the tools I have now, back then, I wonder if we could have evolved the company. But just at that point in time, it didn't make sense. And I think the other point when I think about that time was like, we had been on the Hornet roster for 3 years at that point. And I don't think everyone has the same experience being on a roster. And I think Hornet and Passion are really, you know, great reps. But for us, it was very much this cycle of like, when you get signed, you're the newest person on the roster. So you're the talent that's the easiest to share with clients and agencies. And also like you probably got signed for a reason. So like you're the hot new talent. So we were basically getting first crack at a lot of all the pitches that were coming in. And I think when we started, we didn't realize that was not the norm. We're just like, oh, this is what it's like to have a rep. Cool. And basically what happens is if you're on a roster, like eventually you are no longer the newest, youngest person on the roster. So if you don't keep making award-winning material or like flashy material or like something that's like a new story, it is much harder for your rep to put you forward. Maybe if you have a really specific point of view, that's not necessarily true because people are coming for like your specific look, but then that also means you're a specialist. So the briefs that are coming to you might be more rare as well. So I think after 3 years in, we were getting significantly less briefs than when we first started. So we were definitely at a point as a company where we're like, financially, we were going to have to start freelancing again. And I think had we been a remote directing team, we probably would have kept freelancing more. And if I were to get signed now, I would probably have mixed it up a lot more with freelancing. But like, I think we were 26 or 27. It didn't make sense for us when we first got signed to necessarily keep up our own freelance business in addition to the work we were doing getting signed as directors. I think we thought like, oh, you're signed, this is it. And it's like, that is how it was, for a lot of it. But I think long term, that's not always the case.
Yeah, I think that's really important to kind of talk about the reality of representation. And, I like how honest you are about how you didn't kind of keep up your freelance stuff and things like that. So essentially, when you started Slanted, were you kind of starting again from scratch?
So it's funny, my original intention with starting Slanted was not to start another studio. I originally started Slanted just as an LLC, the way many freelancers do to get paid. But what I was surprised by was after having been in the industry for 8 or so years at that point was in addition to the freelance inquiries I was getting, I had also met some people who are now coming to me with budgets and more like projects. Like they were like, I have this 30-second animation. Can I just give you a flat budget to make it? Rather than like, can you come in for whatever, $500 a day, $700 a day, whatever day rate. And so luckily I had the kind of initial framework with the LLC to be able to take on those types of projects. But I think, the Slanted's like 6 years old now or 7 years old. The first year I was doing day rate freelancing, I would say 90% of the time and doing project based 10% of the time. And then like the next year it was like 70% day rate, 30% project fee. And then the next year was like 40, 60. And it wasn't until the fourth year in business was the first year I didn't take any freelance work. But even then, like in my 5th year and 7th year, I still will occasionally take freelance, like technical direction jobs, just because there are really interesting projects that you can only do with a certain amount of infrastructure and a certain amount of scale. And it's like Slanted is a 3-person studio. There's only so big of a thing we can tackle. And so that means the scope of the type of problems we're asked to solve is only of a certain scale. And so sometimes it is fun to step away, to go somewhere else and like work with a larger team, meet new people, and like problem solve on a scale that I wouldn't be able to do here at Slanted.
Yeah, I think that's great that you broke it down for us, because I always think people think, oh, there's a new studio. It came out of nowhere. It's great, blah, blah, blah. They don't see like the 3 years before that when you were like mostly doing freelance work as well, and then kind of building it up with like a little team and stuff like that. So I think that's really, really cool. Do you think that making lots of pivots in your career sort of has helped you grow stronger as an artist?
It's funny. There has been kind of these major shifts every, 3 to 6 years. And I think that goes back to always wanting to learn new things. And I definitely think every time you kind of learn a new angle, you draw on all the experiences you had previously. So like, I would say one of the more recent pivots was I got a lot more serious about what does it mean to be a small business owner. The first 3 years of Slanted, we did what in the US is called 1099ing freelancers. So like I would only hire out once I knew I had a budget available, and then I would assemble a team, but I would 1099 everyone because it's not like I had a huge studio space for people to come in and work out of. And then around year 3, I took a business class because I was like, okay, if I'm really going to do this, it's just the money was getting to the point where I was like, surely there's a lot of things I don't know. Like I've just been doing this all reactionary, and like I really have to figure out how to actually like run a business. So I signed up for this like business course, local business course through the NYU Stern School of Business. And I kind of came out of that learning a lot, but also realizing that like it's not like there's this tome of knowledge somewhere that's like, this is the right way to start a business and this is how you start a business. Like actually, like I had been running a business the whole time. I just like believed there was this right way to do it that I didn't know how. But it's like, it's actually like, if you're doing it, you are doing it. So at year 3, I got more serious about running the business. And then I kind of made the leap into being like, let me hire employees. In the US, it's called W-2 employees, where you actually have full-time staff, and kind of jumped into that world of starting to be like, do we offer health insurance? Like, do we have a maternity, paternity leave policy? Like workers' comp, like all these crazy things that like, other things people usually think of when they're thinking about starting their own business. But I think a lot of learning to think logistically like that, and just like all the different type of people I met through that, I think has made me become a better director and has maybe become a better boss, which means like, you know how to work with your team even better, which means like you guys can all make things that are better products in the end because you're working together better. So I think that is all a roundabout way of saying that the more pivots you make, or I guess a looser way to say it is like the wider your range of experience, the more different ways you have of looking at something to bring to the table, which ultimately will make you a better creative.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I also think it's kind of interesting because you've kind of spent a few years doing this, a few years doing that, like quite a few years doing some stuff. And then it's kind of just life experience as well, I think, a little bit. Like as you get a bit older, you kind of learn about more stuff. And you were talking about earlier about how what success means to you changes over the years. So I just wondered if you wanted to tell us a bit about, you know, what success used to mean to you and what success means to you now.
Oh, that's such a good question. You know, actually, in the business class I took, the first thing they make you read is a Harvard Business Review article called "The Questions Every Entrepreneur Must Answer." And it basically is forcing you to focus and define why you want to be a business owner. And answers like, oh, because I want to be creative, or like, oh, I want to set my own hours, is like actually too loose, right? So it's like you have to, in very concrete terms, define what success means to you. And I remember when we were in the Mixtape Club era, success, it was very like goalpost driven, I'd say. So I think getting signed by Hornet was a huge thing that we were shooting for, or like getting to direct our own music video, or getting to work with a certain artist, or getting to freelance at a certain studio, or getting to win a certain award, or getting your film into a certain film festival, or getting featured on a certain blog. I think those all represented success to us. But I think also there was this weird thing that happened where, you know, maybe you didn't get those things, or maybe you did, but if you did, there was always like a new goalpost that would appear. And like the thing that I'm personally sad about is I think at the time I didn't take enough time to appreciate like our successes. Cause I think in the moment I was always very like, oh, cool, we did that thing. But like now we really have to like get this other thing done. And I think part of that was working in commercials. Like even when you succeeded at something, there was always like the actual job you were working on that had an immediate deadline like that day, but also one at the end of the week and also one in 2 weeks. So I was very, I think my mindset was very like, I was only ever thinking about the next 60 days, like the next 2 months, because the deadlines that were happening in the next 2 months were like just very like looming very high for me. So there was kind of a revelation that happened later where I was like, oh, this idea that learning this piece of software or, getting featured on a blog or getting to work with a certain person, that doesn't change anything. Like inside, the happiness or the anxiety or whatever I was feeling like was still constant. So I was like, oh, the thing that has to change is me. So that was kind of a big revelation that it's like, there was always this idea that like, oh, I'm working really hard so that like one day things will be better. And I was like, oh no, like the 70-hour work week will never become not a 70-hour work week unless it comes from inside. It's not actually external forces that are driving it. It's internal. So I think that leads that's a good lead to like in the very early Slanted era, like when I first left Mixtape Club, I remember having conversations with colleagues where I was like, okay, if I can work enough to pay my rent and save some money and have enough free time to like have a vegetable garden and like the vegetable garden doesn't die and be outside enough to tend it. And like, I'd just gotten my dog and I was like, and like play with my dog a little, like that is success. And like, that was kind of the North Star for a couple of years, was like literally like, let's just change gears to try to figure out how to make it so there's enough free time to basically make more time for outside life. And like, when you do that, do you feel like the work suffers? Like, do you feel like your career is suffering? Or are you still like, do you still feel like you're growing your skills and are you happy with the work? And then even though my focus wasn't to be successful, like those were the years where I went from being freelancing 90% of the time to freelancing 30% of the time and taking on more and more projects. So the business did grow, even though I wasn't necessarily striving for the old goals. And then I think the goalpost changed again when Slanted did grow, where I was like, okay, there's this opportunity to figure out how to build something bigger than yourself, right? I think that was very appealing to me as an opportunity with Slanted, where it's like, rather than the goal being building an individual project that I'm proud of, you're trying to build a system of like how to build things, and you're trying to build a place that allows people to do their best work, and a place that like embodies a lot of your values and ideals about how to approach work. So I think that was the goal for a couple of years. And then I think I had my son last year, and that like just flipped everything upside down. So I think I'm still formulating now what my goals are, but it does involve like, I don't know, like figuring out what your new identity is as a parent. And I guess for me now, the volatility of being a business owner / freelancer is more daunting than it used to be. Like it used to not bother me that much, but I have a totally different relationship now, I feel like, with stability and boundaries and being able to devote home time as home time. I guess those are the changes over the years.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you mentioned that you're a parent now, and how that does affect your work life, because that's also something that never really gets talked about that much. I mean, do you feel like you've become more understanding of other people, like when they're parents, and kind of some of the sacrifices they make? And then what kind of things have you put into place in your business that you think may be a little bit different, or is it just kind of having a different mindset?
Oh, yes. It has both changed how I view my work and how I do my work. I think I had a really interesting moment. My son was probably 6 months old, and I was kind of just starting to like reintegrate, and I was like meeting up with some of my professional friends who are also parents. And I remember having lunch and saying, I don't know what to do, because the way I used to solve problems was always with time. And like, even if I hired a freelancer and like, you know, their work wasn't up to snuff, like I knew I could stay late and like tweak the motion or bang out the boards or do whatever, you know, and stay super late. And even if I didn't get it to where I wanted by the time I left the studio, it's like I knew I had tried the hardest I possibly could to get it to where I wanted. And like, now that I was a parent, like that just wasn't an option. Like I couldn't solve problems with my time anymore. And I think that fed into this larger idea of like, oh my God, like I think this value system that had been an undercurrent to the entire way I had operated up until then was like now thrown totally into question. Because if you believe that actual time in the seat is the thing that provides value, and like you can no longer do that, then like, does that fundamentally make you like a bad worker or a bad team member? And I think that was an incredibly like threatening prospect to wrestle with. And I think, I mean, ultimately where I came out was that it is never the time necessarily. Like the actual physical hours in the seat is like not where the value is produced. It's the individual themselves. And it's like their perspective and like how the ideas they bring on how to solve the problem. And to another degree, like how they function as a member of the team, because it's not even necessarily like talent only. It's also like, what's the energy you're bringing and like how well do you collaborate with everyone? That honestly is where most of the value comes from when you're working with people. And it's like not necessarily the fact that someone can physically stay in the seat till exactly 7 p.m. or till 2 a.m. or whatever. But I think, I don't know if this is just an American thing or like, I know it's not just our industry, but like, I think that was something very real that I had to wrestle with in terms of like, what are some deeply rooted beliefs that I used to have that might be incredibly problematic that I think I had to deal with after I became a parent. But I think, you know, I think people are thrown into that situation, not just like if they become parents, like what do you do if you have like a close friend or family member who's ill and you need to be a caretaker, you know, or like what happens if you have these other commitments that require your time? You know, it could even be like you yourself. And it's like that you don't see that. And hopefully, you know, you're in a place where your employers don't see that as a limitation. Because I think if thinking that it's like the literal physical hours that someone can throw at something like produces better product, then that is going to result in a limitation about the type of works that get made and the type of stories that get told, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is super important, you know, like mentioning people who, you know, might have to be people who take care of their family and stuff as well. It doesn't matter, like you say, whether you're a parent or you have other things in your personal life. I think it's super interesting. Like it's a really interesting topic. And I used to remember when I used to work full time, the people who were parents or who had something else that you know they needed to get to, they're always like the most efficient people as well. And they seem like maybe they got like more done because they were like, I have to leave here by 5 p.m. like because I've got to go and pick up my son or whatever. Then they would always make sure that they got their work done, you know, on time and quickly because they had that commitment. So sometimes I think it can work, you know, definitely in your favor. And I definitely don't believe that we have to be like, you know, sat in the seat like 15 hours a day to make great work. I believe that if we have like shorter deadlines and we really, really focus, then we could get our work done quicker. Definitely.
Definitely. I totally agree. I think I have definitely had to come up with a lot more efficient scheduling. And I think, you know, it's funny, this may seem tangentially related, but I'll bring it back around. In the business class I took, one of the exercises they made you do is if you had to sell your business, you know, basically like what's the presentation you give, like, and you have to get everything ready as if you wanted to sell your business. as an exercise. And I was like, that's insane. Like, it doesn't even make sense. Like, why would I sell Slanted? But it just like didn't make sense to me. But the thing I came to realize is it was super healthy because, you should be running your business as if someone wanted to buy it, it would be appealing to them. Like, you should be running your business with a certain level of profit. And I think a lot of, freelancers, especially like people who go from freelance to running a studio, it's like you keep your profit margins super low because you're really used to being like, oh, I got my day rate, like I'm happy, But when you kind of make the jump into doing a business, especially if you're a business that wants to grow, it's like you do have to add in that profit margin so that you're okay during the slow months, or that when you do want to make a jump, like, oh, I want to go to a bigger studio space, and then you have to foot the bill for like moving plus like first month, last month, or whatever, first 3 months commercial rent, like you have the capital there. Otherwise, like you're hamstrung until you have the money you need to make those moves. So I think thinking about your business in a way, what if I did sell it, produces in the end a much more sustainable, healthy business. And similarly, like if, as you said, you have to leave at 6, or if I know that it's not for sure that I'm in the office all day because, this is like a side note, my son was born premature. So that first year he had a ton of doctor's appointments. So I was constantly out of the office. Like I think the first 2 months he was home, I was out of the office at least once a week to drive him to like all these different random specialists. So it's like we basically had to tighten up all of the operations at Slanted so that if Michelle couldn't be there at the office, like business could still run as usual. And we came up with all these solutions. Like we got way better at using the calendar. Like I personally started like getting super into time boxing stuff. And like all of those things actually made the business much, much, much healthier, and like made it in a way because a lot of the tools were also more clearly defining people's job roles and also made it easier to onboard new people. I guess, again, it just made the business a lot healthier having those limitations.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, like to think about if you're going to sell your business to someone else, because I know that when people start freelancing, it's kind of a different thing, but similar, is that they always think, okay, well, what was my full-time rate? Like, my full-time salary, and then like just divide that up into a day rate. And it's like, no, you can't do that because you have like so much more stuff like tax and like in the US health insurance. And then, stuff like you're saying, you need to make profit so that you can plan for the future and plan for like big unexpected things that might happen, So it's just, it was making me think about that. And it just kind of, it's quite funny. People don't really think about this stuff. And especially like you say, like if you wanted to move studio or something like that, and all these unexpected costs that we don't really think about when we get started.
Totally. There's actually a really great website that Stephanie Swart actually just shared with me called whatismydayrate.com. And I haven't totally reviewed the math on it, but it's kind of amazing where you enter, like you'd be like, I want to make $75,000 a year. And then it tells you what your day rate and hourly rate should be, calculating in the fact that, you will be probably, if you're in the US, you're going to be paying 30% taxes. And like also calculate, what's nice is like they have forms too for like, well, if you're on salary, a lot of companies give you a bonus at the end of the year, which we've subbed in at 10%. So like when I did that, I was like, oh yeah, no place I've worked has ever given me a bonus, 0. But, it has spaces for these variables you can tweak, but it takes into account some of that math. So I thought that was like an amazing tool that someone made and put online.
Yeah, awesome. We'll put that in the show notes for sure so people can check it out. So if there's one piece of advice you'd like the audience to take away from this, what would that be?
Someone once said to me, time is long, I think is how they said it. It was a really nice way of just thinking about how I feel like everyone's always in a rush. And I definitely felt with my career, like I felt very much in a rush and like there was no time, or I was like always behind, or I was like always this sense of impending doom that I had to like turn something in and get it done faster. And I think recently I just feel more and more like, actually, life is super long, and like there's time for people to switch careers, and like, you know, life can surprise you, and sometimes it just makes sense to like wait and see how things go, and like that there's this idea that like it's okay, like you can change your mind and like change course, and then like if you decide to do that, you will plug away, and like it's going to be okay. Time is long. I think also I had a business coach, and she also brought up the idea of people always framing work-life balance as like a daily thing or a weekly thing. And she's like, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be that short of a time span. It can also be over years. Like, you know, what happens if this is your year where you just focus on saving up money and creating stability for yourself so that you can maybe have more choices later because you've saved up so much money, or, you know, try to get rid of your debt? Or what happens if this is your year of focusing on your personal life, and then maybe next year is like your year of focusing on something else? And she's like, you know, what happens if it ends up being decades? What if you have a decade where you focus on your family? And then like what's interesting is this idea of like, what happens if you focus that much time on something is like, you may end up being a different person at that end of the chunk of time, but you'll never know if you're like not committing to something for that long of a period of time.
Yeah, I think that's a really great advice. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was awesome to have you here.
Thank you so much, Haley.
That was awesome. Thanks so much again to Michelle for coming on the show. If you enjoy the podcast and it helps you, it would be awesome if you could go over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. If you want, you can also get the opportunity to ask podcast guest questions and join some live Q&As that we do over at our Patreon. So if you want to check that out, you can go to patreon.com/motionhatch. I hope you all enjoyed the episode. Have a great week. See ya.